The roar of Marcus's Harley Davidson echoed through their suburban driveway at exactly 11:47 p.m., a sound that had become as predictable as his lies about working late. Elena Martinez pressed her face against the bedroom window, watching her husband of 15 years climb off the gleaming black motorcycle he'd bought 3 months ago during what he cheerfully called his Renaissance period. What he didn't know was that she'd been tracking every mile he rode, every stop he made, and every blonde-haired reason he'd suddenly developed such a passionate interest in weekend rides to wine country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The private investigator's photos were tucked safely in her office safe, but Elena didn't need them anymore to know that Marcus's midlife crisis had come with more than just leather jackets and weekend warrior fantasies. It had come with Amber Sullivan, a 28-year-old yoga instructor who apparently found middle-aged men on motorcycles absolutely irresistible. What Marcus didn't realize was that his wife had been preparing for this moment far longer than he'd been planning his escape. She watched him wheel the motorcycle into the garage with the careful precision of someone who'd had a few drinks but was trying not to show it. His movements were slower than usual, more deliberate, and she could see the satisfied smirk on his face even from the second-floor window. He thought he was so clever, so smooth, dividing his time between his devoted wife and his exciting new girlfriend. If only he knew that Elena had been 3 steps ahead of him since the day she'd first noticed the suspicious mileage on his weekend rides. Elena had always been the perfect wife by Marcus's standards. She maintained their pristine home in the expensive Meadowbrook neighborhood, attended his company functions with grace and enthusiasm, and never questioned his increasing need for personal space as he approached his 45th birthday. She'd even encouraged his motorcycle purchase, suggesting he deserved something exciting after years of driving practical sedans and minivans during their daughter's childhood years. Their twin daughters, Sophia and Isabella, were now freshmen at Stanford and Berkeley, respectively, their tuition paid in full thanks to Elena's meticulous financial planning throughout their marriage. Marcus had always assumed his wife's contribution to their wealth came from her part-time work as a freelance graphic designer, creating logos and websites for small businesses from their home office. He'd never bothered to look closely at her client list or ask detailed questions about her projects. If he had, he might have discovered that her small business clients included Fortune 500 companies who valued her discretion as much as her design skills. But Marcus had always been more interested in talking about his own achievements than learning about hers. As regional sales director for Morrison Technologies, he commanded respect at industry conferences and earned a substantial salary that he believed funded their comfortable lifestyle. He had no idea that Elena's invisible income had been quietly outpacing his for the past 8 years, or that she'd been carefully documenting every aspect of their marriage for reasons he was about to discover. The morning after his latest midnight motorcycle ride, Marcus appeared in their spacious kitchen looking refreshed and energetic despite his late night. He kissed Elena's cheek with the practiced affection of a man who'd mastered the art of compartmentalizing his life, then poured himself coffee from the expensive Italian machine she'd bought him for his last birthday. "Good ride last night?" Elena asked casually, not looking up from her laptop where she was reviewing quarterly reports for what Marcus assumed was another small business logo project. "Amazing weather for riding," he replied, settling into his usual chair at the breakfast bar. "Took the coastal route, stopped in Half Moon Bay for dinner. You should come with me sometime." The lie slid off his tongue so smoothly that Elena almost admired his commitment to the performance. According to her tracking app, he'd spent exactly 3 hours at Amber's apartment in downtown San Francisco, nowhere near Half Moon Bay. But she simply nodded and smiled, playing the role of the trusting wife while mentally adding this deception to her growing collection. "Maybe next weekend," she said, though they both knew she'd find some excuse to stay home. Elena had never shown much interest in motorcycles, which Marcus had initially found disappointing, but now clearly considered a blessing. His weekend freedom depended on her predictable disinterest in his new hobby. Marcus finished his coffee and gathered his briefcase, kissing her goodbye with the same mechanical affection he'd shown for months. "Late meeting tonight," he announced, as if she hadn't heard this exact phrase at least twice a week for the past 4 months. "Don't wait up." "Of course, honey," Elena replied, her voice carrying just the right note of understanding disappointment. "I'll keep dinner warm just in case." After his BMW disappeared down their tree-lined street, Elena allowed herself a moment of dark satisfaction. Marcus thought he was living a perfectly orchestrated double life, but he was actually dancing to music she'd been composing for months. Every lie he told, every secret meeting he attended, every romantic gesture he thought he was hiding, all of it was being carefully cataloged and prepared for the performance of a lifetime. She opened her laptop and pulled up the real project she'd been working on during breakfast, a comprehensive business proposal that would change both of their lives forever. The document was titled Acquisition Strategy, Morrison Technologies Regional Division, and it represented 18 months of careful planning, financial maneuvering, and strategic patience. Marcus had no idea that his wife had been quietly assembling the resources to buy his entire division, along with the power to restructure his career in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Elena's freelance graphic design business was actually the front for a sophisticated investment consortium she'd built through a network of silent partnerships and holding companies. While Marcus had been climbing the corporate ladder at Morrison Technologies, she'd been climbing a different kind of ladder, one that led to the kind of wealth and influence that could purchase entire companies without attracting attention. The irony was delicious. Marcus's affair with Amber had begun around the same time Elena had seriously considering the Morrison acquisition. His betrayal had provided the perfect motivation to accelerate her timeline, transforming what might have been a purely financial decision into something far more personal and satisfying. Her phone buzzed with a text message from David Chen, her investment advisor, and the only person who knew the full scope of her financial empire. "Board meeting confirmed for next Friday. Morrison executives will be informed of the acquisition on Monday morning. Are you ready for this?" Elena smiled as she typed her response. "More than ready. 15 years of preparation tends to build confidence." The Morrison Technologies acquisition had been surprisingly easy to arrange once Elena decided to stop hiding her resources. The company had been struggling with declining regional sales, largely due to Marcus's increasingly distracted management style, and the board had been quietly seeking a buyer for months. Elena's consortium offered exactly what they needed: enough capital to restructure without the publicity of a major corporate takeover, and a management philosophy that valued discretion over headlines. What made the deal particularly elegant was that Marcus would technically be keeping his job, at least initially. The new ownership structure would be announced as a partnership rather than an acquisition, and existing management would be invited to stay during the transition period. Marcus would have no reason to suspect that his wife had orchestrated the entire arrangement until she chose to reveal herself. Elena spent the morning reviewing personnel files for Marcus's division, paying particular attention to his recent performance evaluations and management decisions. The picture that emerged was troubling but not surprising. His attention to detail had declined significantly over the past year. Several major clients had complained about his responsiveness, and his team had begun working around him rather than with him on critical projects. Under normal circumstances, these issues might have been addressed through standard corporate channels, performance improvement plans, additional training, or gradual reassignment to less critical roles. But Elena wasn't interested in normal circumstances. She was interested in justice, the kind that could only be achieved through complete control over the situation. The private investigator's report on Marcus and Amber made for fascinating reading alongside his professional evaluations. Their relationship had followed a predictable pattern: initial attraction during one of Marcus's weekend motorcycle trips, escalating through regular meetings, and now settling into a routine that had Marcus spending 3 evenings a week at Amber's apartment while maintaining the facade of a devoted husband at home. What particularly intrigued Elena was the financial aspect of Marcus's double life. He'd been spending heavily to maintain his new relationship: expensive dinners, weekend getaways, jewelry that definitely wasn't appearing in Elena's jewelry box. The money was coming from their joint savings account, which Marcus had been steadily draining without discussion or explanation. In his mind, he was simply taking what was rightfully his from their shared assets. He had no idea that Elena had been monitoring every transaction and had already moved the majority of their actual wealth into accounts he'd never seen. The money he thought he was spending belonged to them both, but the money he didn't know about belonged entirely to her. By the time he discovered the true scope of her financial independence, it would be far too late for him to make any claims on resources she'd never shared. Elena closed the laptop and walked through their meticulously maintained house, seeing it with new eyes. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen decoration, every sign of their supposedly perfect life together, all of it had been built on her invisible labor and financial contributions, while Marcus took credit for their success. Soon, he would discover exactly how much of their lifestyle had depended on resources he'd never controlled. The master bedroom contained the evidence of 15 years of marriage, photos from vacations, gifts from anniversaries, mementos from their daughters' childhoods. Elena had been genuinely happy during many of those moments, truly believing in the partnership she thought she was building with Marcus. That made his betrayal more painful than simple infidelity. It represented the destruction of a trust she'd worked years to build. But pain had a way of crystallizing into purpose, and Elena's purpose was now laser-focused on ensuring that Marcus faced the consequences of his choices in the most educational way possible. He would learn that actions have ramifications, that betrayal carries a price, and that the wife he'd taken for granted had been far more powerful than he'd ever imagined. Her phone rang, interrupting her meditation on revenge and justice. The caller ID showed Marcus's office number, which was unusual for a weekday morning when he should have been in meetings. "Elena, I'm sorry to bother you at home," came the voice of Janet Morrison, Marcus's assistant. "Is Marcus with you by any chance? He was supposed to be in a client presentation 10 minutes ago, but he never arrived." Elena frowned, genuinely surprised. Whatever else could be said about Marcus, he'd always been reliable about important meetings. Missing a client presentation was completely out of character, even for someone juggling a secret relationship. "He left for the office at his usual time," Elena replied. "Have you tried calling his cell phone?" "Straight to voicemail," Janet said, her voice carrying a note of professional concern. "The clients are getting impatient, and Mr. Patterson is asking questions." Patterson was Marcus's immediate supervisor, a man whose patience with employee irregularities was legendary for its absence. Missing a major client meeting without explanation wasn't just unprofessional, it was potentially career-ending, especially for someone whose performance had already been declining. "I'll try to reach him," Elena offered, though she had no intention of actually helping Marcus avoid the consequences of his poor choices. "Can the meeting be rescheduled?" "I'm working on it," replied. "But between you and me, Elena, this isn't like Marcus. He's been distracted lately, but he's never just disappeared before a big presentation." After Janet hung up, Elena sat quietly, contemplating this unexpected development. Marcus's increasing irresponsibility was accelerating his professional decline faster than she'd anticipated, which could complicate her carefully orchestrated plans. She needed him to remain employed at Morrison Technologies long enough for her acquisition to take effect, but his self-destructive behavior was threatening to derail that timeline. She dialed his cell phone, which indeed went straight to voicemail. His phone was either turned off or dead, neither of which made sense for someone who claimed to be at work. Elena felt a flicker of genuine concern mixed with her anger. Despite everything, they'd been married for 15 years, and his complete disappearance was genuinely unusual. A thought occurred to her, unpleasant but increasingly likely. What if Marcus's relationship with Amber had reached some kind of crisis point? What if he was planning to leave Elena entirely, perhaps sooner than she'd expected? The possibility would destroy all of her careful planning, robbing her of the satisfaction of revealing her power at the moment of maximum impact. Elena grabbed her keys and headed for her car, a modest Honda Accord that fit perfectly with her image as a part-time freelance designer. If Marcus was making some kind of dramatic gesture, she needed to know about it immediately.
Her entire strategy depends on controlling the timing and circumstances of their confrontation, and she couldn't allow him to seize that initiative through some impulsive decision. The drive to Amber's apartment building took 25 minutes through morning traffic, giving Elena time to consider various scenarios and her responses to each.
If Marcus was having some kind of emotional breakdown at his girlfriend's apartment, Elena needed to decide whether to intervene or let events unfold naturally. If he was planning to leave Elena for Amber, she needed to accelerate her own timeline to ensure she maintained the upper hand. But as she turned into the parking structure beneath Amber's building, Elena discovered something that changed everything. Marcus's motorcycle was there, parked in its usual visitor space, but Marcus himself was nowhere to be seen. More troubling was the presence of two police cars parked near the building entrance, their red and blue lights casting strange shadows in the underground garage. Elena parked and approached the building cautiously, her mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened to Marcus? To Amber? Was this some kind of domestic situation or something more serious? She'd been so focused on orchestrating her husband's professional downfall that she'd never considered the possibility of genuine crisis or danger. The lobby was filled with residents and police officers, their conversations creating a buzz of confusion and concern. Elena approached the front desk, where a security guard was speaking with a police sergeant about building access and security footage. "Excuse me," Elena said, trying to project the right mixture of concern and authority. "I'm looking for my husband. His motorcycle is in your garage, but he missed an important meeting this morning. Is everything all right?" The police sergeant turned to study her, his expression professional but guarded. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification. Can you tell me your husband's name and which apartment he was visiting?" Elena's heart began beating faster as she realized she was walking into a situation far more complex than Marcus's simple affair. She handed over her driver's license and took a deep breath before answering. "Marcus Martinez. He's been visiting someone in apartment 3B, Amber Sullivan." The sergeant exchanged glances with his partner before responding. "Mrs. Martinez, I think we need to have a conversation. Is there somewhere private we can talk?" The world seemed to shift beneath Elena's feet as she followed the officers to a quiet corner of the lobby. Whatever had happened here, it was serious enough to require police involvement, and Marcus was somehow at the center of it. All of her careful planning, all of her strategic preparation, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility that something terrible had occurred. "Mrs. Martinez," the sergeant began gently, "when was the last time you spoke with your husband?" Elena found herself answering automatically, her mind struggling to process the implications of the question. "This morning, around 7:30. He left for work at his usual time." "Why? What's happened?" The sergeant consulted his notes before continuing. "We received a call about a disturbance in apartment 3B around 6 this morning. When we arrived, we found evidence of an altercation, but both Mr. Martinez and Miss Sullivan were gone. We've been trying to locate them to determine what happened." Elena felt the ground shifting beneath everything she thought she understood about her situation. An altercation. Both of them missing. Police involvement. This was no longer a simple case of marital infidelity that she could address through financial manipulation and strategic revelation. "What kind of altercation?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "We can't share all the details of an ongoing investigation," the sergeant replied, "but there was significant property damage and signs of a physical struggle. We found blood, Mrs. Martinez. Not a large amount, but enough to suggest someone was injured." Elena sank into a nearby chair as the full implications hit her. While she'd been planning her elaborate revenge for Marcus's betrayal, something far more serious had been developing in his secret relationship. The affair she'd been tracking so carefully had apparently escalated into violence, and now both her husband and his girlfriend were missing. "Mrs. Martinez, we're going to need you to answer some questions about your husband's recent behavior," the sergeant continued. "Any changes in his mood? Any mentions of problems with Sullivan? Any indication that their relationship might have become unstable?" Elena stared at the officer, realizing that her careful documentation of Marcus's affair had suddenly become potential evidence in a criminal investigation. All of her strategic planning, all of her financial maneuvering, all of her dreams of orchestrated revenge, Everything had been swept away by circumstances she'd never anticipated. The perfect wife's imperfect husband had apparently become something much more dangerous than an unfaithful spouse, and Elena was about to discover just how little she actually knew about the man she'd been married to for 15 years. The police station interview room smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant, a combination that made Elena's stomach churn as she sat across from Detective Ray Castellanos. 3 hours had passed since the discovery at Amber's apartment building, and Elena's carefully constructed world was unraveling faster than she could process. Detective Castellanos was a weathered man in his early 50s, with kind eyes that seemed to see through every careful answer Elena provided. He'd been patient with her shock and confusion, but she could sense his growing interest in the details of her marriage that she'd never expected to discuss with law enforcement. "Mrs. Martinez, I need you to think carefully about your husband's behavior over the past few months," Detective Castellanos said, consulting a thick file that had appeared during their conversation. "Any signs of increased stress, anger issues, financial problems, anything that might suggest he was under unusual pressure?" Elena shifted in the uncomfortable plastic chair, acutely aware that every word she spoke was being recorded. The irony wasn't lost on her that after months of secretly documenting Marcus's behavior for her own purposes, she was now being asked to share that information to help locate him in what appeared to be a criminal investigation. "Marcus has been different lately," she admitted carefully. "More secretive, staying out later, claiming to work longer hours. I assumed it was job stress, but now I realize there was more happening than I understood." What she didn't tell Detective Castellanos was that she'd been tracking Marcus's movements with GPS, monitoring their financial accounts, and building a comprehensive file on his extramarital activities. That information felt dangerous to share, as if admitting her own surveillance might somehow implicate her in whatever had happened at Amber's apartment. Detective Castellanos made notes in a small leather notebook, his pen scratching quietly in the sterile room. "Did your husband ever mention Amber Sullivan specifically? Any indication that their relationship might have been troubled or volatile?" Elena considered her response carefully. According to her private investigator's reports, Marcus and Amber's relationship had seemed relatively stable, following predictable patterns of secret meetings and romantic getaways. There had been no indication of violence or serious conflict between them. "He never mentioned her by name," Elena said truthfully. "I only learned about her existence recently, and I had no indication that their relationship involved any kind of conflict or violence." The detective looked up from his notes, studying Elena's face with the practiced attention of someone trained to read deception. "Mrs. Martinez, how exactly did you learn about Miss Sullivan if your husband never mentioned her?" Elena felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. This was the question she'd been dreading, the one that would require her to admit the extent of her own surveillance and investigation. She could lie, but she sensed that Detective Castellanos would eventually uncover the truth, and being caught in a deception would make her look suspicious in ways she couldn't afford. "I hired a private investigator," she said quietly. "About 2 months ago, I became suspicious of Marcus's behavior and decided to find out what was really happening." Detective Castellanos set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "That's a significant step, Mrs. Martinez. What specifically made you suspicious enough to hire professional surveillance?" Elena realized she was entering dangerous territory. Admitting the full scope of her knowledge about Marcus's affair would inevitably lead to questions about her other activities, including the Morrison Technologies acquisition that was supposed to be her ultimate weapon against his betrayal. But lying to the police during a missing persons investigation involving potential violence seemed even more risky. "The usual signs," she said, "changed routines, unexplained absences, financial irregularities. I needed to know the truth before deciding how to address the situation." "Financial irregularities," Detective Castellanos repeated, making another note. "Can you be more specific about that?" Elena took a deep breath, knowing that every answer was pulling her deeper into a conversation she'd never planned to have. "Marcus had been withdrawing money from our joint savings account without discussing it with me, significant amounts, spent on things that weren't appearing in our household expenses." "How significant are we talking about?"
Approximately $15,000 over the past 4 months, Elena replied, the number etched in her memory from weeks of careful accounting. Detective Castellanos whistled softly. That's substantial money for most people. Did you confront your husband about these withdrawals? No, Elena admitted. I was gathering information before deciding how to handle the situation. The detective studied her for a long moment before asking his next question. Mrs. Martinez, what exactly were you planning to do with the information your private investigator collected? Elena felt trapped.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The honest answer would reveal her elaborate plan to acquire Marcus's company and systematically destroy his career, which would make her look vindictive and potentially unstable, but she couldn't think of a plausible lie that wouldn't eventually be exposed by further investigation. I was considering divorce, she said, which was technically true, even if it represented only a small part of her actual intentions. I wanted to understand the full scope of his deception before consulting with an attorney. Detective Castellanos nodded, but his expression suggested he sensed there was more to the story. He consulted his file again before continuing. I'm going to need copies of everything your private investigator gathered: photos, reports, financial records, anything that might help us understand your husband's recent activities and relationships. Elena's mind raced. The private investigator's files contained detailed documentation of Marcus's movements, including locations, times, and even photographs of him with Amber. That information could be valuable for the police investigation, but it would also expose the extent of her surveillance in ways that might raise uncomfortable questions about her own behavior and motivations. Of course, she agreed. I'll contact my investigator and have him send you everything he collected. What's the investigator's name and contact information? Elena provided the details, knowing that Detective Castellanos would soon learn far more about her recent activities than she'd intended to reveal. Thomas Brennan was a thorough professional who documented everything meticulously, which had been exactly what Elena wanted when she'd hired him. Now that thoroughness felt like a potential liability. Mrs. Martinez, I have to ask this next question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, Detective Castellanos said, his tone becoming more serious. Where were you between midnight and 8 this morning? Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was being asked for an alibi. The implication was clear. The police were considering the possibility that she might have been involved in whatever had happened at Amber's apartment. I was at home, she said immediately. I went to bed around 10:30 and woke up at 6 when my alarm went off. I saw Marcus come home on his motorcycle around midnight, but I didn't speak with him. Can anyone verify that you were home during that time period? Elena realized with growing alarm that she had no alibi. Marcus had been out with Amber. Their daughters were away at college, and she'd spent the evening alone working on her laptop. There was no one who could confirm her whereabouts during the critical hours when the altercation had apparently occurred. No, she admitted, I was alone. Detective Castellanos made more notes, and Elena could practically see the suspicion forming in his mind. A wife who discovered her husband's affair, hired a private investigator to document his activities, and had no alibi for the time when violence had occurred at his girlfriend's apartment. The circumstances looked increasingly damning from a police perspective. Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to need you to stay available for further questions, Detective Castellanos said, closing his file. Don't leave town without notifying us, and please provide those investigators' reports as soon as possible. Elena nodded, though her mind was spinning with the implications of her situation. What had begun as her secret plan for elaborate revenge had suddenly transformed into a potential murder investigation where she was apparently a suspect. The power and control she'd thought she possessed over the situation had evaporated completely. As she left the police station, Elena tried to process the magnitude of the crisis she was facing. Marcus and Amber were missing after what appeared to be a violent altercation. The police considered her a potential suspect, and her carefully orchestrated acquisition of Morrison Technologies was scheduled to proceed in just 4 days. Everything she'd worked toward for months was at risk of being destroyed by circumstances completely beyond her control. Her phone rang as she reached her car, the caller ID showing David Chen's number.
Elena hesitated before answering, knowing that her investment advisor was expecting updates on the Morrison acquisition timeline, but she wasn't ready to explain that her husband had disappeared in the middle of what might be a criminal investigation. "Elena," David's voice carried his usual professional urgency, "I've been trying to reach you all morning. The Morrison board wants to accelerate the announcement timeline. They're concerned about market stability and want to make the acquisition public by Wednesday instead of Friday." Elena sank into her driver's seat, overwhelmed by the collision of her two separate worlds. "David, we need to talk. Something's happened that could complicate the entire Morrison situation." "What kind of complication?" David's tone shifted immediately to concern. "Elena, we have $17 million committed to this acquisition, with additional financing arrangements that depend on completing the transaction this week. What exactly has happened?" Elena realized she needed legal advice more than investment advice. "I can't discuss it over the phone. Can you meet me at my office in an hour? And David, you might want to bring your attorney." After ending the call, Elena sat quietly in the police station parking lot, trying to organize her thoughts and priorities.
The Morrison Technologies acquisition that was supposed to be her weapon against Marcus's betrayal had become a potential liability in a missing persons investigation. Her secret surveillance of Marcus's affair had made her look like a vengeful wife with motive for violence. And somewhere in the city, her husband and his girlfriend were missing after what appeared to be a serious altercation. The drive home took her through the affluent neighborhoods where she'd built her perfect life, past the country club where she and Marcus had attended countless social functions, and along the tree-lined streets where their daughters had grown up believing their parents had an ideal marriage. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but Elena knew that her world had fundamentally changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her house felt different when she entered, no longer the sanctuary she'd carefully maintained, but rather a crime scene waiting to be discovered. Elena walked through the rooms with new eyes, wondering what evidence might exist of Marcus's recent behavior, what clues the police might find if they obtained a search warrant, and what secrets might be revealed if her private life was subjected to criminal investigation. The home office where she'd spent months planning her elaborate revenge now felt like a liability. Her computer contained detailed financial records showing her true wealth, communication with David Chen about the Morrison acquisition, and research into Marcus's professional vulnerabilities. If the police searched her electronic devices, they would discover a level of financial sophistication and strategic planning that contradicted her image as a part-time freelance designer. Elena sat at her desk and opened her laptop, staring at the files that represented months of careful preparation. The Morrison acquisition documents, the financial analysis of Marcus's department, the personnel evaluations she'd obtained through her consortium's due diligence process, all of it could be misinterpreted as evidence of an elaborate plot against her husband that had escalated to violence. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Coffee shop on 5th Street in 1 hour. Come alone." Elena stared at the message, her pulse quickening. The unknown number could be Marcus trying to contact her secretly, or it could be someone with information about what had happened to him and Amber. But it could also be a trap, either from whoever had been involved in the altercation or from someone trying to manipulate her during her moment of vulnerability. She screenshot the message and forwarded it to Thomas Brennan, her private investigator, with a brief note asking him to trace the number if possible. Then she sat back in her chair, trying to decide whether meeting an unknown contact was worth the risk when she was already under police suspicion. Another text arrived from the same number. "Your husband is safe, but he's not coming home. If you want to understand what really happened, meet me in 1 hour." Elena felt a mixture of relief and fear wash over her. Marcus was apparently alive and safe, which eliminated her worst fears about the blood and violence at Amber's apartment. But the message suggested that he was staying away voluntarily, which raised entirely new questions about his motivations and plans. She grabbed her purse and keys, making the impulsive decision to attend the meeting despite the potential risks. If Marcus was safe but hiding, she needed to understand why and what it meant for both the police investigation and her own carefully laid plans. The unknown contact clearly had information she needed, and waiting passively for events to unfold was no longer an option.
The coffee shop on 5th Street was a small, independent establishment in the Arts District, the kind of place that attracted writers and students rather than business professionals. Elena arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the back with clear sight lines to both entrances. She ordered a latte she didn't want and tried to project calm confidence while her mind raced through possibilities. At exactly the appointed time, a woman in her early 30s approached Elena's table. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, with short dark hair and intelligent eyes that suggested both caution and determination. She slid into the seat across from Elena without introduction or hesitation. "Mrs. Martinez," the woman said quietly, "my name is Jessica Palmer. I'm a private investigator, and I've been watching your husband for the past 3 months." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her once again. Another private investigator had been surveilling Marcus, which meant someone else had been tracking his movements and documenting his behavior. But who and why? "Who hired you?" Elena asked directly, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. Jessica Palmer smiled grimly. "The same person who's been planning to destroy your husband's career and reputation for the past year. Someone who has access to resources that make your Morrison Technologies acquisition look like small change." Elena's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. Someone with greater wealth and power than her own had been orchestrating a campaign against Marcus that dwarfed her own revenge plans. Her carefully constructed strategy had been operating within someone else's larger game, and she was only now discovering the true scope of the forces at work. "Who?" Elena demanded, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Jessica Palmer reached into her bag and withdrew a manila envelope, placing it on the table between them. "Victoria Morrison," she said quietly, "the founder's daughter and the real power behind Morrison Technologies, the woman your husband has been systematically defrauding for the past 2 years." Elena opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding photographs and financial documents that told a story she'd never suspected. Marcus hadn't just been having an affair and declining in his professional performance. He'd been stealing from Morrison Technologies through a complex scheme of falsified expense reports, fictitious client accounts, and diverted company resources. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Marcus had stolen nearly $200,000 from Morrison Technologies over 2 years, using sophisticated accounting methods that had avoided detection by standard auditing procedures. But Victoria Morrison's private security team had been tracking every fraudulent transaction, building an airtight case for criminal prosecution.
Victoria Morrison has been planning to have your husband arrested for embezzlement and fraud, Jessica Palmer continued. But she wanted to wait until she had enough evidence to ensure conviction and maximum prison time. The plan was to let him steal enough money to guarantee a lengthy sentence, then destroy him professionally and personally in the most public way possible. Elena struggled to process this information. Marcus wasn't just an unfaithful husband with declining job performance. He was an active criminal who'd been stealing from his employer for years. The Morrison Technologies acquisition she'd been planning wasn't just elaborate revenge. It was unknowingly interference with a criminal investigation. "What does this have to do with what happened at Amber's apartment?" Elena asked, though she was beginning to fear the answer. Jessica Palmer's expression became even more serious. "Amber Sullivan isn't just a yoga instructor who happened to catch your husband's eye. She's an undercover investigator working for Victoria Morrison's security team. She's been documenting Marcus's criminal activities from the inside while maintaining the cover of being his girlfriend." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Marcus's affair, which she'd discovered and been planning to use against him, was actually an elaborate undercover operation designed to gather evidence of his criminal behavior. Amber wasn't his victim or willing participant. She was a professional investigator building a case that would destroy him completely. "Then what happened last night?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus discovered Amber's real identity," Jessica Palmer replied. "He found evidence that she was working for Victoria Morrison and realized that his relationship with her had been entirely fabricated. The altercation at her apartment was his reaction to learning that everything he thought he knew about their relationship was a lie."
Elena sat back in her chair, trying to absorb the magnitude of the deception that had surrounded her life for months. While she'd been secretly planning to acquire Morrison Technologies and orchestrate Marcus's professional downfall, Victoria Morrison had been using an undercover investigator to document his criminal behavior and prepare for his arrest. Both women had been operating elaborate schemes against the same man, completely unaware of each other's activities. "Where is Marcus now?" Elena asked. "Safe, as I told you," Jessica Palmer replied, "but also under surveillance by Victoria Morrison's security team. He's not being allowed to return home or contact you directly because Victoria Morrison wants to control the timing and circumstances of his arrest." Elena realized that her husband had become a pawn in a game much larger and more dangerous than her own plans for revenge. Victoria Morrison commanded resources that dwarfed Elena's own wealth and influence, and Marcus's criminal behavior had made him vulnerable to prosecution that could result in years in prison. "What does Victoria Morrison want from me?" Elena asked, sensing that this meeting had a specific purpose beyond simply providing information. Jessica Palmer leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "She wants you to cancel the Morrison Technologies acquisition and step away from any involvement with the company. Your interference is complicating her criminal case against Marcus, and she's willing to take whatever steps are necessary to protect her investigation." A surge of anger mixed with her fear and confusion. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm offering you a choice," Jessica Palmer replied calmly. "Cancel the acquisition voluntarily and walk away, or have Victoria Morrison use her influence to ensure that your involvement becomes part of the criminal investigation. She has enough power to make you look like a co-conspirator in Marcus's crimes, regardless of your actual innocence." Elena stared at the other woman, recognizing the implicit threat despite its polite delivery. Victoria Morrison was offering her a way to avoid being dragged into Marcus's criminal prosecution, but only if she abandoned the revenge plan she'd spent months developing and millions of dollars implementing. "I need time to consider this," Elena said finally. Jessica Palmer stood and gathered the envelope from the table. "You have until tomorrow morning to make your decision. Victoria Morrison is planning to have Marcus arrested on Thursday, with or without your cooperation. If you want to avoid being caught in the aftermath, I suggest you make the right choice." After Jessica Palmer left, Elena remained at the coffee shop for another hour, trying to process everything she'd learned. Her husband wasn't just an unfaithful spouse, he was a criminal whose illegal activities had attracted the attention of someone with far more power and resources than Elena had ever possessed. Her own elaborate revenge plan had unknowingly interfered with a sophisticated criminal investigation, and now she was being forced to choose between abandoning her carefully laid plans and risking prosecution herself. The perfect wife's perfect revenge had collided with imperfect reality in ways she'd never anticipated, and Elena was beginning to understand that some games were too dangerous to play, no matter how justified the desire for justice might be. Elena spent the night staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through impossible choices and unacceptable outcomes. By dawn, she'd reached a conclusion that surprised her with its clarity. Victoria Morrison had made a fundamental miscalculation in assuming that Elena would simply retreat when faced with superior force. The threat to make her look like a co-conspirator in Marcus's crimes was powerful, but it also revealed something crucial about Victoria's position. She needed Elena's cooperation to keep her criminal case clean and uncomplicated. That need created leverage, and Elena had built her fortune by recognizing and exploiting leverage wherever she found it. At 7 in the morning, Elena called David Chen with instructions that made him question her sanity. Instead of canceling the Morrison Technologies acquisition, she wanted to accelerate it and expand its scope. Rather than backing down from Victoria Morrison's threat, Elena intended to acquire enough of Morrison Technologies to force a direct confrontation with the woman who thought she could intimidate her into submission. "Elena, this is incredibly risky," David protested over the phone. "You're talking about investing an additional $40 million in a hostile acquisition of a company owned by someone who's already threatened you."
"If this goes wrong, you could lose everything." "If I back down now, I lose everything anyway," Elena replied, her voice steady with newfound determination. Victoria Morrison expects me to be intimidated by her threats, but she's made the same mistake Marcus did, underestimating what I'm capable of when I'm pushed into a corner. The revised acquisition strategy was audacious in its scope and timing. Instead of purchasing Marcus's regional division, Elena's consortium would attempt to buy controlling interest in Morrison Technologies itself, using the company's financial vulnerabilities and board politics to force through a rapid takeover before Victoria Morrison could mount an effective defense. Elena spent the morning on conference calls with investment banks, legal teams, and board members she'd cultivated over months of careful networking. The financial markets opened to news that an unknown consortium was launching an aggressive takeover bid for Morrison Technologies, causing the stock price to surge and triggering emergency board meetings across the corporate landscape. By noon, Elena was sitting in the conference room of Morrison Technologies headquarters, facing a board of directors who'd been summoned for an emergency session to address the takeover attempt. Victoria Morrison sat at the head of the table, her expression carefully controlled, but her eyes burning with fury at Elena's unexpected boldness. Victoria Morrison was an elegant woman in her early 50s, impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from a lifetime of commanding rooms filled with powerful men. She'd built Morrison Technologies from her father's small engineering firm into a multinational corporation, and her reputation for ruthless business tactics was legendary throughout the industry. "Mrs. Martinez," Victoria said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that made her words sound deceptively warm. "I understand you've made an offer for our company that the board feels compelled to consider. I have to say, your timing is rather interesting given recent developments." Elena met Victoria's gaze directly, recognizing the implicit reference to Marcus's criminal activities and the threats that had been made the previous day. "Business opportunities rarely wait for convenient timing, Miss Morrison. When I identify undervalued assets with strong growth potential, I move quickly to secure them." The board members exchanged glances, clearly sensing the undercurrent of tension between the two women, but uncertain about its source. Elena had prepared for this moment by researching each board member's background, financial interests, and potential vulnerabilities. She knew exactly which arguments would resonate with each individual and how to present her acquisition as beneficial to their personal and professional interests. "Your offer is certainly generous," said board member Richard Hawthorne, a banking executive who Elena knew was concerned about Morrison Technologies' recent performance struggles. "But it's also highly unusual for a consortium with no previous relationship to our company to make such an aggressive bid." Elena had anticipated this concern and prepared her response accordingly. "My consortium has been tracking Morrison Technologies for over a year as part of our strategy to invest in companies with strong technological foundations but temporary management challenges. Your recent quarterly reports suggest significant unrealized potential in both your research division and international markets." It was a carefully crafted half-truth that emphasized Morrison Technologies' actual business potential while avoiding any mention of Elena's personal motivations or her husband's connection to the company. The board members nodded approvingly, recognizing the analysis as sophisticated and well-informed. Victoria Morrison's expression remained neutral, but Elena could see the calculation in her eyes as she processed the implications of Elena's strategy. By framing the acquisition as a standard business transaction based on financial analysis rather than personal vendetta, Elena was forcing Victoria to respond within professional rather than personal parameters. "Miss Martinez," Victoria said carefully, "I'm curious about your consortium's background and experience with technology companies. This would be a significant investment for any group, and our board needs to understand your qualifications and intentions." Elena smiled, having prepared extensively for exactly this line of questioning. "My primary background is in strategic financial consulting, with particular expertise in identifying undervalued assets and optimizing their performance through targeted investment and management restructuring. Our consortium includes former executives from several major technology firms, as well as financial partners with extensive experience in corporate turnarounds." She distributed folders containing detailed biographical information about her consortium members, all of whom were real professionals with impressive credentials who'd agreed to participate in the acquisition based on its financial merits rather than any knowledge of Elena's personal motivations.
Board member Patricia Chen, who Elena knew had been pushing for new leadership at Morrison Technologies, leaned forward with interest. Mrs. Martinez, what specific changes would your consortium implement if this acquisition were to proceed? Elena had spent considerable time developing her answer to this crucial question, knowing that the board's decision would ultimately depend on her confidence in her ability to improve Morrison Technologies' performance and profitability. Our preliminary analysis suggests 3 primary areas for improvement, Elena began, consulting her notes with practiced professionalism. First, expansion of your international market presence, particularly in emerging economies where demand for your technology solutions is growing rapidly but remains underserved. Second, optimization of your research and development pipeline to focus on the most commercially viable innovations while discontinuing projects with limited market potential. Third, restructuring of regional management to eliminate redundancies and improve operational efficiency. The third point was her subtle reference to Marcus's division, which she intended to completely reorganize regardless of his criminal activities or current whereabouts. Victoria Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly as she recognized the implicit threat to her carefully constructed criminal case, but she couldn't object without revealing information that would compromise her investigation. "Those are interesting proposals," Victoria replied evenly. "However, any major restructuring would need to be implemented carefully to avoid disrupting existing operations and relationships." Elena nodded as if she were simply acknowledging a reasonable business concern. "Naturally, our consortium believes in thorough due diligence and gradual implementation of changes based on detailed analysis of each division's performance and potential." The coded language was clear to Victoria Morrison, even if it was meaningless to the other board members. Elena was indicating that she intended to conduct her own investigation of Marcus's activities and would not be deterred by threats or intimidation from pursuing whatever course of action served her interests. The board discussion continued for another hour, with Elena fielding questions about financing, timeline, and regulatory approval, while Victoria Morrison sat silently, clearly recognizing that her position was weaker than she'd anticipated. Elena's acquisition offer was legitimate and financially attractive, supported by credible partners and sound business reasoning that the board was finding difficult to reject. Finally, Board Chairman William Foster called for a preliminary vote on whether to proceed with formal consideration of the acquisition offer. Elena watched the faces around the table as hands were raised, counting votes, and assessing the political dynamics that would determine her success or failure. The vote was 6-3 in favor of proceeding, with Victoria Morrison among the minority opposition. Elena had achieved her first objective by forcing the board to take her offer seriously despite Victoria's obvious preferences, but she knew the real battle was just beginning.
As the meeting concluded, Victoria Morrison approached Elena with the practiced smile of someone who'd spent decades in corporate warfare. "Ms. Martinez, I wonder if we might have a private conversation about your acquisition proposal. There are certain aspects of Morrison Technologies' current situation that might be relevant to your decision-making process." Elena agreed, recognizing that Victoria was offering to negotiate directly rather than continuing the battle in front of the board. They walked to Victoria's executive office, an impressive space that radiated power and success through its carefully chosen artwork, expensive furnishings, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Once the door was closed, Victoria's demeanor shifted from professional courtesy to cold directness. "Ms. Martinez, let's dispense with the business facade and discuss what's really happening here. You know about your husband's criminal activities, you know about my investigation, and you know that your acquisition attempt is an effort to interfere with a legal process that could result in significant jail time for Marcus Martinez." Elena remained standing, projecting confidence despite the tension in the room. "Ms. Morrison, I know that you've been conducting unauthorized surveillance of my husband, that you've used deceptive practices to gather evidence against him, and that you've threatened to implicate me in crimes I didn't commit if I don't abandon a legitimate business transaction." Victoria moved to her desk and opened a thick file folder, displaying photographs and financial documents that Elena recognized as evidence of Marcus's embezzlement activities. "Your husband has stolen nearly $200,000 from my company over the past 2 years. I have documented proof of every fraudulent transaction, every falsified expense report, and every diverted company resource.
When I present this evidence to federal prosecutors, Marcus Martinez will face charges that could result in a decade in prison. Elena remained standing, projecting confidence despite the tension in the room. Ms. Morrison, I know that you've been conducting unauthorized surveillance of my husband, that you've used deceptive practices to gather evidence against him, and that you've threatened to implicate me in crimes I didn't commit if I don't abandon a legitimate business transaction. Victoria moved to her desk and opened a thick file folder, displaying photographs and financial documents that Elena recognized as evidence of Marcus's embezzlement activities. Your husband has stolen nearly $200,000 from my company over the past 2 years. I have documented proof of every fraudulent transaction, every falsified expense report, and every diverted company resource. When I present this evidence to federal prosecutors, Marcus Martinez will face charges that could result in a decade in prison. Elena examined the evidence, recognizing that it was comprehensive and damaging enough to destroy Marcus completely if presented to law enforcement. But she also noticed something that Victoria might not have considered. The evidence had been gathered through methods that could be challenged in court, particularly the undercover operation involving Amber Sullivan. This evidence was obtained through entrapment, Elena said calmly. You used an undercover investigator to establish a romantic relationship with my husband for the specific purpose of gathering information that could be used against him in criminal proceedings. A competent defense attorney would argue that Amber Sullivan's activities constituted improper inducement and that any evidence gathered through their relationship should be excluded from prosecution. Victoria's expression flickered with surprise, suggesting that she hadn't fully considered the legal vulnerabilities in her investigation strategy. Elena pressed her advantage, recognizing that she'd identified a weakness in Victoria's position. Furthermore, Elena continued, your threats against me could be construed as witness intimidation and obstruction of justice if this matter proceeds to criminal court. You've acknowledged that you're willing to falsely implicate me in crimes to protect your case against Marcus, which creates serious ethical and legal problems for your prosecution strategy. Victoria sat down heavily in her executive chair, clearly recognizing that Elena had identified significant flaws in her carefully constructed plan. The undercover operation that had seemed so clever when implemented was now creating legal vulnerabilities that could compromise the entire case against Marcus. What do you want? Victoria asked bluntly, her southern charm completely abandoned in favor of direct negotiation. Elena smiled, recognizing that she'd successfully shifted the balance of power in the conversation. I want Marcus to face appropriate consequences for his actions, but through legitimate legal processes rather than elaborate schemes that could backfire in court. I want assurance that I won't be implicated in crimes I didn't commit simply because I was married to someone who made poor choices. And I want my acquisition of Morrison Technologies to proceed based on its business merits rather than being derailed by personal vendettas. Victoria studied Elena for a long moment, clearly reassessing her initial impression of the woman she'd assumed would be easily intimidated. You're proposing that we work together rather than against each other. I'm proposing that we both get what we actually want rather than destroying each other in pursuit of revenge, Elena replied. You want Marcus prosecuted for his crimes. I want him to face consequences for his betrayal and criminal behavior. We can achieve both objectives more effectively through cooperation than through continued conflict. Elena outlined her proposal over the next 30 minutes, presenting a strategy that would satisfy both women's desire for justice while avoiding the legal complications that could arise from Victoria's current approach. Instead of relying on evidence gathered through the undercover operation, they would provide law enforcement with financial documentation that clearly demonstrated Marcus's criminal activities without raising questions about entrapment or improper investigation techniques. Elena's forensic accounting resources, combined with Victoria's inside knowledge of Morrison Technologies' financial systems, could build an airtight case against Marcus that would be virtually impossible for him to defend against in court. The acquisition would proceed as a legitimate business transaction, but Marcus's division would be immediately restructured in ways that would expose his criminal activities to proper law enforcement scrutiny. In essence, Elena concluded, you get your criminal prosecution of Marcus, I get my acquisition of Morrison Technologies, and we both avoid the legal and personal complications that would result from continued conflict. Victoria considered the proposal carefully, clearly recognizing its advantages over her current strategy. What about Marcus himself? Where is he now, and how do we ensure he doesn't flee before prosecution can proceed? Elena had anticipated this question and prepared a comprehensive answer. According to your investigator, Marcus is currently under surveillance by your security team. However, keeping him hidden indefinitely creates legal problems related to kidnapping and unlawful detention. Instead, we should arrange for him to return home under controlled circumstances that allow law enforcement to monitor his activities while building their case. The logistics were complex but manageable. Marcus would be allowed to return home and resume his normal activities, but under constant surveillance by both law enforcement and private security teams. His access to Morrison Technology systems would be restricted, preventing further criminal activity while allowing investigators to monitor his behavior and gather additional evidence. Elena would proceed with the acquisition, but would cooperate fully with law enforcement in exposing Marcus's criminal activities once the transaction was complete. Victoria would abandon her threats against Elena and would support the acquisition as beneficial to Morrison Technology's future success. There's one more element we need to address, Victoria said after agreeing to the basic framework of Elena's proposal. Amber Sullivan has been working undercover for months, and her safety could be at risk if Marcus discovers the full extent of our cooperation. We need to ensure she's protected while maintaining the integrity of any legal proceedings. Elena nodded, recognizing the humanitarian concerns as well as the practical necessity of protecting someone who'd been instrumental in exposing Marcus's crimes. This evidence was obtained through entrapment, Elena said calmly. You used an undercover investigator to establish a romantic relationship as my husband for the specific purpose of gathering information that could be used against him in criminal proceedings. A competent defense attorney would argue that Amber Sullivan's activities constituted improper inducement and that any evidence gathered through their relationship should be excluded from prosecution. Victoria's expression flickered with surprise, suggesting that she hadn't fully considered the legal vulnerabilities in her investigation strategy. Elena pressed her advantage, recognizing that she'd identified a weakness in Victoria's position. Furthermore, Elena continued, your threats against me could be construed as witness intimidation and obstruction of justice if this matter proceeds to criminal court. You've acknowledged that you're willing to falsely implicate me in crimes to protect your case against Marcus, which creates serious ethical and legal problems for your prosecution strategy. Victoria sat down heavily in her executive chair, clearly recognizing that Elena had identified significant flaws in her carefully constructed plan. The undercover operation that had seemed so clever when implemented was now creating legal vulnerabilities that could compromise the entire case against Marcus. What do you want? Victoria asked bluntly, her southern charm completely abandoned in favor of direct negotiation. Elena smiled, recognizing that she'd successfully shifted the balance of power in the conversation. I want Marcus to face appropriate consequences for his actions, but through legitimate legal processes rather than elaborate schemes that could backfire in court. I want assurance that I won't be implicated in crimes I didn't commit simply because I was married to someone who made poor choices. And I want my acquisition of Morrison Technologies to proceed based on its business merits, rather than being derailed by personal vendettas. Victoria studied Elena for a long moment, clearly reassessing her initial impression of the woman she'd assumed would be easily intimidated. You're proposing that we work together rather than against each other. I'm proposing that we both get what we actually want, rather than destroying each other in pursuit of
Amber should be relocated immediately and provided with new identity documents if necessary. Her testimony will be crucial to any prosecution, but her safety takes priority over legal considerations. The conversation continued for another hour as they worked out the specific details of their cooperation agreement. Elena would maintain her acquisition timeline, but would provide Victoria with complete access to Morrison Technologies' financial records once the transaction was completed. Victoria would provide Elena with all evidence of Marcus's criminal activities, but would ensure that law enforcement understood Elena had no involvement in or knowledge of her husband's crimes. By evening, they had reached a comprehensive agreement that satisfied both women's primary objectives while minimizing the risks and complications that had threatened to destroy them both. Elena would get her acquisition and the satisfaction of seeing Marcus face appropriate consequences for his betrayal. Victoria would get her criminal prosecution without the legal vulnerabilities that had been created by her elaborate undercover operation. By evening, they had reached a comprehensive agreement that satisfied both women's primary objectives while minimizing the risks and complications that had threatened to destroy them both. Elena would get her acquisition and the satisfaction of seeing Marcus face appropriate consequences for his betrayal. Victoria would get her criminal prosecution without the legal vulnerabilities that had been created by her elaborate undercover operation. The next morning brought news that Marcus Martinez had voluntarily surrendered to federal authorities and was being charged with embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes against Morrison Technologies. Elena's acquisition of the company was approved by the board and would be completed within 60 days, making her one of the youngest women ever to control a major technology corporation. Elena stood in her new office at Morrison Technologies headquarters, looking out over the city where she'd built her fortune and orchestrated her revenge against the husband who'd betrayed her trust. The view was spectacular, but more important was the sense of closure that came from knowing that justice had been served through legitimate means rather than elaborate schemes that could have backfired catastrophically. Elena would get her acquisition and the satisfaction of seeing Marcus face appropriate consequences for his betrayal. Victoria would get her criminal prosecution without the legal vulnerabilities that had been created by her elaborate undercover operation. The next morning brought news that Marcus Martinez had voluntarily surrendered to federal authorities and was being charged with embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes against Morrison Technologies. Elena's acquisition of the company was approved by the board and would be completed within 60 days, making her one of the youngest women ever to control a major technology corporation. Elena stood in her new office at Morrison Technologies headquarters, looking out over the city where she'd built her fortune and orchestrated her revenge against the husband who'd betrayed her trust. The view was spectacular, but more important was the sense of closure that came from knowing that justice had been served through legitimate means rather than elaborate schemes that could have backfired catastrophically. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia and Isabella, her daughters, who'd seen the news coverage of their father's arrest and their mother's acquisition of Morrison Technologies. "Mom, we always knew you were amazing, but this is incredible. We're proud of you for handling everything with such class and strength." Elena smiled, realizing that her daughter's respect and admiration meant more to her than any business success or personal revenge could ever achieve. She'd protected them from the worst aspects of their father's criminal behavior while building a legacy they could be proud to inherit. Victoria Morrison appeared at Elena's office door, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing an expression of grudging admiration. "I have to admit, Elena, when I first met you, I underestimated your capabilities. Your strategy was more sophisticated than anything I'd anticipated." Elena accepted the champagne and raised her glass in a toast. "To the power of women who refuse to be underestimated or intimidated, regardless of the circumstances they face." The 2 women drank in comfortable silence, both recognizing that they'd achieved more through cooperation than either could have accomplished through continued conflict. Elena's perfect revenge had evolved into something more valuable, a legitimate victory that created lasting success rather than temporary satisfaction. 3 months later, Elena received a letter from Marcus in federal prison, where he was serving a 7-year sentence for his crimes against Morrison Technologies. The letter was brief and formal, acknowledging his responsibility for the destruction of their marriage and expressing regret for the pain he'd caused their daughters. Elena read the letter once, then filed it away without responding. Marcus's apology was unnecessary. His actions had already provided her with everything she'd needed to build a better life for herself and their daughters. The motorcycle he'd bought during his midlife crisis was still in their garage, a reminder of the poor choices that had led to his downfall, but Elena had no interest in dwelling on past betrayals when the future held so much promise. Morrison Technologies under Elena's leadership became one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the industry, expanding into international markets and developing innovative solutions that transformed entire sectors of the global economy. Elena's strategic vision and management expertise proved that her success wasn't dependent on revenge or personal vendetta, but rather on genuine business acumen and leadership capability.
The media coverage of Elena's rise from unknown housewife to corporate executive became a business school case study in strategic thinking and crisis management. Her story inspired countless women who'd been underestimated by their husbands, employers, or society in general, proving that patience, preparation, and intelligence could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. But for Elena herself, the greatest satisfaction came from the quiet moments in her executive office when she could reflect on the journey that had brought her from discovering Marcus's affair to controlling a billion-dollar corporation. She'd learned that the best revenge wasn't making someone else suffer, but rather building something so successful and meaningful that their betrayal became irrelevant to your happiness. The perfect wife had become the perfect CEO, not through elaborate schemes of personal vengeance, but through the patient application of intelligence, resources, and strategic thinking to challenges that would have destroyed someone with less preparation and determination. Marcus's midlife crisis motorcycle had indeed come with a midlife girlfriend, but it had also come with consequences he'd never imagined and opportunities Elena had spent years preparing to seize. In the end, Elena's story wasn't really about revenge at all. It was about transformation, resilience, and the power of refusing to let someone else's poor choices determine the trajectory of your own life. The motorcycle still sat in her garage, but Elena had moved far beyond the woman who'd once watched her husband return from his secret adventures. She'd become someone who created her own adventures and built her own legacy regardless of the obstacles or betrayals that others might place in her path. The game had been won not through elaborate schemes or personal vendetta, but through the simple application of superior strategy, patience, and the kind of quiet strength that had always been Elena's greatest asset. Marcus's midlife crisis had indeed changed everything, but not in the way he'd expected when he'd first climbed onto that gleaming black Harley Davidson and ridden toward what he thought was freedom. Elena Martinez had discovered that the best revenge was living well, building something meaningful and proving that some people's betrayals were actually opportunities in disguise, if you had the intelligence and determination to recognize them as such. Elena Martinez never expected her husband's midlife crisis to come with a side of federal charges, but life had a way of delivering lessons in the most unexpected packages. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, she found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had transformed her from a suburban housewife into the CEO of a major technology corporation. The path hadn't been linear, and the destination certainly hadn't been what she'd originally planned when she first discovered those suspicious credit card charges and late-night motorcycle rides. The irony wasn't lost on her that Marcus's betrayal had ultimately led to her greatest professional triumph. Without his affair, she might never have been motivated to investigate Morrison Technologies so thoroughly. Without his criminal activities, she might never have discovered the company's vulnerabilities and opportunities. Without his complete self-destruction, she might never have found the courage to step fully into her own power and claim the success she'd been quietly building for years. But success, Elena had learned, came with its own complications and responsibilities that no amount of strategic planning could fully prepare you for. Running Morrison Technologies required skills that went far beyond financial analysis and investment strategy. She needed to understand technology development, international markets, regulatory compliance, and the complex human dynamics of managing thousands of employees across multiple continents. The learning curve had been steep, but Elena discovered that her years of managing a household, raising daughters, and maintaining the facade of a perfect marriage had actually provided excellent preparation for corporate leadership. The same attention to detail that had kept her family's complex schedule running smoothly now helped her manage the intricate logistics of product development and market expansion. The diplomatic skills she'd developed during years of company social events translated perfectly to board meetings and client negotiations. Most importantly, the patience and strategic thinking she'd cultivated while secretly building her investment portfolio served her well in the long-term planning required to transform Morrison Technologies from a struggling regional company into a global competitor. Elena had learned to think in terms of years rather than quarters, building sustainable competitive advantages rather than pursuing quick profits that could disappear when market conditions changed. The technology industry proved to be a fascinating challenge that engaged Elena's intellect in ways her previous work never had. Morrison Technologies specialized in enterprise software solutions, helping large corporations manage their data, communications, and operational processes more efficiently. The field required constant innovation as client needs evolved and new technologies emerged, creating opportunities for companies that could anticipate market changes and develop solutions before their competitors recognized the demand. Elena's strategic vision and management expertise proved that her success wasn't dependent on revenge or personal vendetta, but rather on genuine business acumen and leadership capability. The media coverage of Elena's rise from unknown housewife to corporate executive became a business school case study in strategic thinking and crisis management. Her story inspired countless women who'd been underestimated by their husbands.
Elena found herself energized by the rapid pace of technological advancement and the creative problem-solving required to stay ahead of industry trends. She spent her first 6 months as CEO meeting with research teams, visiting client sites, and attending technology conferences to understand both the current capabilities of Morrison's products and the emerging needs that would drive future development. The international expansion opportunities were particularly exciting. Morrison Technologies had focused primarily on North American markets under previous leadership, but Elena's analysis revealed significant untapped demand in European and Asian markets where digital transformation was accelerating rapidly. Companies in these regions were investing heavily in new technology infrastructure, creating opportunities for Morrison solutions if they could be adapted to different regulatory environments and business cultures. Elena began traveling extensively, visiting potential clients and partners in London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Singapore. These trips required her to develop new skills in cross-cultural communication and international business practices, but they also provided her with insights into global markets that would prove invaluable in positioning Morrison Technologies for sustained growth. The personal satisfaction of building something meaningful proved to be more rewarding than Elena had anticipated when she'd first started planning her revenge against Marcus. Creating jobs, developing innovative solutions to real business problems, and building a company that contributed positively to the global economy felt far more significant than simply destroying her unfaithful husband's career would have been. But the transition from housewife to CEO hadn't been without its challenges and critics. The business media was fascinated by Elena's story, but their coverage often focused more on the dramatic circumstances of her rise than on her actual business accomplishments. Headlines like "Housewife's Revenge Leads to Corporate Takeover" and "From Betrayed Wife to Tech CEO" emphasized the personal drama rather than the strategic brilliance that had made her success possible. Elena learned to navigate media attention with the same careful preparation she applied to every other aspect of her professional life. She hired an experienced communications firm to help her craft messages that emphasized Morrison Technologies' business achievements while maintaining appropriate privacy about her personal life. The goal was to shift public perception from seeing her as a vengeful ex-wife who'd gotten lucky to recognizing her as a legitimate business leader who'd earned her position through competence and hard work. The process of gaining credibility in the technology industry required Elena to prove herself repeatedly in ways that male CEOs rarely faced. She needed to demonstrate technical knowledge, strategic thinking, and leadership capabilities while overcoming assumptions that she was either unqualified for her position or had achieved it through circumstances rather than merit. Elena addressed these challenges by surrounding herself with experienced advisors and team members who could complement her strengths and help her develop areas where she lacked experience. She hired a chief technology officer with deep expertise in software development, a head of international operations who understood global markets, and a communications director who could help her build relationships with industry analysts and media representatives. More importantly, Elena focused on delivering measurable business results that would speak louder than any criticism or skepticism about her background. Under her leadership, Morrison Technologies achieved record quarterly revenues, expanded into 7 new international markets, and developed 3 breakthrough products that won industry awards for innovation and effectiveness. The company's stock price tripled during Elena's first year as CEO, validating her strategic vision and silencing most critics who had questioned her qualifications. Institutional investors who had initially been skeptical began praising her long-term thinking and disciplined approach to growth, while industry analysts upgraded their recommendations for Morrison Technologies based on the company's improved performance and market position. Elena's daughters, Sophia and Isabella, provided crucial emotional support during the challenging transition period. Both young women had inherited their mother's intelligence and determination, and they understood the complexity of the situation Elena was navigating better than most of her professional advisors. They helped her maintain perspective during difficult moments and reminded her that her success was creating opportunities for other women who might face similar challenges in their own lives.
The relationship with Victoria Morrison evolved from wary cooperation to genuine mutual respect as both women recognized the benefits of their partnership. Victoria's knowledge of Morrison Technologies' history and culture proved invaluable during Elena's first months as CEO, while Elena's strategic vision and financial resources allowed Victoria to pursue technological innovations that had been impossible under the company's previous financial constraints. Their collaboration became a model for how former adversaries could work together effectively when they shared common goals and complementary skills. Victoria remained involved as head of research and development, focusing on the technical innovations she was passionate about, while Elena handled the strategic and financial aspects of running the company. The federal prosecution of Marcus proceeded smoothly once Elena and Victoria stopped working against each other and began cooperating with law enforcement. The evidence of his criminal activities was overwhelming, and his defense attorney ultimately recommended accepting a plea bargain rather than risking a longer sentence if the case went to trial. Marcus's 7-year prison sentence provided a sense of closure without the satisfaction Elena had once expected to feel from his downfall. By the time he was sentenced, she was so immersed in building Morrison Technologies' future that his punishment felt more like a necessary administrative detail than the climax of an elaborate revenge plot. The experience taught Elena that the most effective justice often came through focusing on positive construction rather than negative destruction. Building something valuable and meaningful proved to be more satisfying than tearing down someone who had betrayed her trust, even when that person deserved the consequences they ultimately faced. Elena's story attracted attention from business schools, women's organizations, and entrepreneurship programs as an example of how personal crisis could be transformed into professional opportunity through strategic thinking and careful preparation. She began accepting speaking engagements at universities and conferences, sharing insights about leadership, strategic planning, and the importance of financial independence for women. The speaking engagements revealed Elena's talent for communication and education, skills she hadn't fully recognized during her years as a housewife and mother. Audiences responded enthusiastically to her combination of practical business advice and personal authenticity, leading to additional opportunities to contribute to leadership development programs and mentorship initiatives. Elena established a scholarship fund at Stanford and Berkeley to support female students pursuing degrees in technology and business, ensuring that her success would create opportunities for the next generation of women leaders. The scholarships were awarded based on academic achievement and leadership potential rather than financial need, recognizing that talented women from all backgrounds could benefit from additional support and encouragement. The scholarship program became a source of particular pride for Elena, connecting her success to a larger mission of advancing women's participation in technology and business leadership. Recipients of the scholarships often reached out to her to thank her for the opportunity and to share their own career achievements, creating a network of successful women who supported and encouraged each other's continued growth. Elena's relationship with her daughters deepened as they witnessed her transformation from victim of betrayal to successful business leader. Sophia and Isabella had always respected their mother, but seeing her build Morrison Technologies gave them a new understanding of her capabilities and potential. They began seeking her advice about their own career decisions and life choices, recognizing that she had wisdom and experience that went far beyond traditional maternal guidance. The family dynamics shifted in positive ways, as Elena's increased confidence and success created space for more honest and open communication. Without the stress of maintaining appearances in an unhappy marriage, Elena could focus on building genuine relationships with her daughters based on mutual respect and shared values rather than social expectations and financial dependencies. Both Sophia and Isabella expressed interest in potentially joining Morrison Technologies after completing their education, though Elena made it clear that they would need to earn their positions through merit and experience rather than family connections. She wanted them to understand that sustainable success required competence and hard work, not just opportunity and privilege. The technology industry's rapid evolution kept Elena constantly learning and adapting her strategic approach to meet emerging challenges and opportunities. Artificial intelligence, cloud computing, cybersecurity, and data analytics were transforming how businesses operated, creating demand for more sophisticated solutions and services than Morrison Technologies had previously offered. Elena invested heavily in research and development, hiring talented engineers and data scientists who could help the company stay ahead of technological trends. trends. She also formed strategic partnerships with universities and research institutions, ensuring that Morrison Technologies had access to cutting-edge innovations that could be commercialized for business applications. The international expansion proved more complex than Elena had initially anticipated, requiring significant investment in local partnerships, regulatory compliance, and cultural adaptation. Different countries had varying approaches to data privacy, business practices, and technology adoption that required careful navigation to avoid costly mistakes or legal complications. Elena learned to work with local partners who understood their home markets better than any American company could from a distance. These partnerships required her to develop skills in international negotiation, cross-cultural communication, and joint venture management that expanded her capabilities as a business leader. The success in international markets validated Elena's strategic vision and provided Morrison Technologies with revenue diversification that reduced dependence on North American clients. The global presence also enhanced the company's reputation and credibility, making it easier to attract top talent and secure favorable financing for continued expansion. Elena's daughters, Sophia and Isabella, provided crucial emotional support during the challenging transition period. Both young women had inherited their mother's intelligence and determination, and they understood the complexity of the situation Elena was navigating better than most of her professional advisors. They helped her maintain perspective during difficult moments.
Elena's public profile continued growing as Morrison Technologies' success attracted media attention and industry recognition. She was named to various Most Powerful Women in Business lists, invited to speak at major conferences, and asked to serve on nonprofit boards and government advisory committees. The recognition was gratifying, but Elena remained focused on the operational challenges of running a rapidly growing company rather than getting distracted by external accolades. She'd learned from observing Marcus's career that professional success required sustained attention to fundamentals rather than pursuit of short-term recognition or glory. The experience of building Morrison Technologies taught Elena valuable lessons about leadership that she hadn't anticipated when she'd first started planning her acquisition strategy. Running a large organization required different skills than managing personal finances or even conducting complex business transactions. She needed to inspire thousands of employees, make decisions with incomplete information, and maintain strategic focus while dealing with countless daily operational challenges. Elena discovered that effective leadership often meant empowering others to do their best work rather than trying to control every aspect of the business personally. She learned to delegate responsibility while maintaining accountability, to provide clear strategic direction while allowing flexibility and tactical implementation, and to build organizational culture that attracted and retained talented people who shared her values and vision. The personal growth that accompanied her professional success surprised Elena with its depth and significance. Discovering her own capabilities and potential after years of subordinating her ambitions to her husband's career and family responsibilities was both liberating and sometimes overwhelming. Elena began working with an executive coach to help her develop leadership skills and manage the psychological challenges of her rapidly changing circumstances. The coaching process helped her understand how her past experiences as a wife and mother had actually prepared her for business leadership in ways she hadn't recognized, while also identifying areas where she needed to develop new capabilities and perspectives. The coaching relationship also helped Elena process the complex emotions surrounding Marcus's betrayal and imprisonment. While she'd achieved the professional success she dreamed of, the personal cost of her marriage's destruction and the impact on their daughters required ongoing attention and healing. Elena learned that success didn't automatically resolve all the emotional challenges created by betrayal and loss. Building Morrison Technologies provided purpose and satisfaction, but it couldn't completely replace the trust and partnership she'd lost when her marriage ended. She needed to develop new sources of personal fulfillment and connection that weren't dependent on professional achievement alone. The work-life balance challenges that came with running a major corporation required Elena to establish new boundaries and priorities that differed significantly from her previous life as a housewife and mother. The demands of international travel, board meetings, client relationships, and strategic planning left little time for the domestic activities that had once provided structure and meaning to her days. Elena hired household staff to manage the practical aspects of maintaining her home, but she also had to learn to find satisfaction in different types of accomplishments and relationships.
The immediate feedback and tangible results of cooking, cleaning, and organizing were replaced by the longer-term and more abstract satisfactions of strategic planning, team building, and market development. The transition required Elena to develop new sources of personal identity that weren't tied to traditional gender roles or family relationships. She was no longer primarily defined as Marcus's wife or Sophia and Isabella's mother, but rather as Elena Martinez, CEO of Morrison Technologies. The change was empowering but also sometimes isolating, as she navigated social and professional environments where she had no established relationships or familiar patterns of interaction. Elena's story became an inspiration for other women facing similar challenges of rebuilding their lives after betrayal, divorce, or major life transitions. She received hundreds of letters and emails from women who had found hope and motivation in her example of transforming personal crisis into professional opportunity. The correspondence revealed that Elena's experience resonated with women from all backgrounds and circumstances who were struggling to find their own paths to independence and success. Some were dealing with infidelity and divorce, others were trying to start businesses or change careers, and many were simply seeking the courage to pursue dreams they'd postponed for family or other obligations. Elena began responding personally to many of these letters, offering encouragement and practical advice based on her own experiences. The correspondence evolved into informal mentoring relationships that provided Elena with perspective on her own journey while helping other women navigate their challenges and opportunities. The mentoring activities led to Elena's involvement with several women's organizations focused on entrepreneurship, leadership development, and economic empowerment. She discovered that sharing her experiences and insights with other women provided a sense of purpose and connection that complemented her business responsibilities. Elena's transformation from housewife to CEO became a case study in business schools and leadership programs, examining the strategic thinking, financial planning, and personal resilience required to navigate major life transitions successfully. Students were particularly interested in understanding how she'd managed to maintain long-term strategic focus while dealing with the emotional turmoil of discovering her husband's betrayal and criminal activities. The academic attention led to opportunities for Elena to contribute to research on women's entrepreneurship, crisis management, and strategic planning. She began collaborating with business school professors on studies examining how personal experiences shaped professional decision-making and leadership development. Morrison Technologies' continued success under Elena's leadership provided ongoing validation of her business acumen and strategic vision. The company's financial performance, market position, and reputation for innovation consistently exceeded industry benchmarks, demonstrating that her success wasn't just a matter of luck or favorable circumstances. The business results silenced most remaining skeptics who had questioned whether Elena's initial success could be sustained over time. Wall Street analysts who had initially attributed Morrison Technologies' improvement to one-time factors began recognizing Elena's leadership as a sustainable competitive advantage that would drive long-term growth and profitability. Elena's approach to corporate governance emphasized transparency, ethical business practices, and stakeholder value creation rather than short-term profit maximization. She believed that sustainable success required building trust with employees, customers, partners, and investors through consistent delivery on promises and commitment to shared values. The governance philosophy reflected lessons Elena had learned from her personal experience with betrayal and deception. She understood that trust was the foundation of all successful relationships, whether personal or professional, and that maintaining trust required ongoing attention to integrity and authenticity in all communications and decisions. Morrison Technologies under Elena's leadership became known for its ethical business practices, employee development programs, and commitment to social responsibility. The company's reputation attracted top talent who wanted to work for an organization that aligned with their personal values, while also creating customer loyalty among clients who valued doing business with trustworthy partners. Elena's success story continued evolving as Morrison Technologies expanded into new markets, developed innovative products, and built strategic partnerships with other leading technology companies. Each achievement built on previous successes while creating new opportunities for continued growth and impact. The journey from betrayed housewife to successful CEO had taken Elena to places she'd never imagined and taught her lessons she couldn't have learned any other way. Marcus's midlife crisis motorcycle had indeed come with unexpected consequences, but the ultimate destination was far better than anything Elena could have planned when she'd first discovered his affair and begun plotting her revenge. The motorcycle still sat in Elena's garage, a reminder of the journey that had brought her from victor to victor through strategic thinking, patient preparation, and the courage to seize opportunities when they appeared. But Elena rarely thought about the motorcycle anymore, too focused on building the future to dwell on artifacts of a past that had led her exactly where she needed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.